She joins us today to talk about it all. Patti, welcome to the show. What about the love story behind Joy Davidman and C.S. Lewis moved you so to make you want to capture it on paper for the first time in Becoming Mrs. Lewis?
What first got me intrigued was that I had always known about their story. I'd always known that Lewis fell in love late in life, that he lost his wife. There's a movie about it, Shadowlands, with Anthony Hopkins. He wrote one of the seminal books on grief called A Grief Observed, about losing his wife. And it hit me that we didn't know her story. She just shows up and she spends the entire movie of Shadowlands and the entire book of A Grief Observed dying. So who was she? And I knew it was an improbable love story because she was an American woman who was married with two kids. So got curious. And whenever I get curious about something, that usually means there's a story waiting. So I started to dive into her history and was stunned to find this fascinating, powerful, genius woman. She was a literal Mensa genius. She was a poet and a novelist. She spent all of her life in New York. She won the Yale Younger Poets Award. She learned to read at 3 years old. She graduated high school when she was 14. And just as important for the story is that she literally changed the last decade of C.S. Lewis's work. Her fingerprints and her influence are all over the last decade of his work. And why didn't I know any of that when I know a lot about Lewis? So I decided the best way to get this information across was in a novel, in a story told from her point of view.
How did you first connect with Joy's voice when you were bringing it to life on the page? Were you referencing diary entries and letters she wrote to C.S. Lewis, that sort of material?
Well, luckily for me, for this historical novel, some of the others have been different, but both of them have loads of writing. That bookshelf behind me, I think two of the shelves are filled with his writing and her writing. So we have letters, essays, poetry. We have the things they wrote to each other. They have things they wrote to other people. They both reviewed books. So they both have this kind of critical review voice that they use. And they both published everything from poetry to novels to nonfiction, both of them. So there was an immense, for this book, it was just pleasurably an immense amount of reading and trying to hear, especially hear her voice, what she cared about, what she wanted, what was hidden in the lines of her poetry, that kind of thing.
Answers to that question are always fascinating, thank you. It's fair to say that this story resonated with readers, becoming an international bestseller and earning you both the coveted Christie Award in 2019 and then the Harper Lee Distinguished Writer Award in 2020. That must have been quite a thrill to see the book take on a life of its own upon release like that.
Woof. It was like trying to drink out of a fire hose, Jake. There was this like income of information and not only the incoming information, because I loved that, but what do I show, not tell, but what do I show you? And there was so much I wanted to show the reader that couldn't end up in the book because it would have been a trilogy. It would have been, this thick. And I had to figure out for myself another way of getting that information out that I thought was so fascinating that couldn't end up in the book. So the paperback has an expanded edition where there's some essays and some further information. And then I did a podcast called Behind the Scenes of Becoming Mrs. Lewis, where I interviewed the seven of the many experts in Lewis's and Joy's life. I cover everything from her poetry to her childhood. I've talked to her son on 2 of the episodes. I talked to the expert on, like I said, her poetry, an expert on his novel, Till We Have Faces, which Joy Davidman wrote with him. Nobody talks about that, right? Nobody talks about the fact that they co-wrote a novel together. It is always Lewis. And I wanted to show that there was no woman behind the man. There was just this woman beside the man who changed his life.
The Titanic of the South, better known as the Pulaski steamship that tragically sunk back in 1938. It was resurrected from history magnificently in your book, Surviving Savannah. What first made you want to set sail on that journey?
I think that the idea of where we get ideas is one of the most fascinating things to talk about. When I'm interviewing an author, the tables are flipped. I always want to know what what we call the origin story. Like, what was the seed for this? Where did this come from? And the interesting part about that is, I don't know, right? So we can, I bet you know the same thing. You have 50 books, Jake. You know that some ideas literally, not figuratively, fly into your mind. You're like, wait a minute, what about that? That's what happened to me with Joy Davidman. But for Surviving Savannah, I have a pal who is a mariner in Bluffton, South Carolina. His name is Boo Harrell. And he kept telling me about this wreck because we have a place in Bluffton, South Carolina, which is right there next to Hilton Head and right there next to Savannah, right across the river. And he kept saying it happened here and it's this little known story and it needs to be told. And I don't know why, but for the first 3 or 4 times he told me about it, I was like, yeah, I don't do shipwrecks. And then one day I said, okay, fine, I'm going to read the article. And it hit me how profoundly impacted the area of Hilton Head, Edisto, Bluffton, Savannah was by this shipwreck in 1838. So I jumped into my research to see if there was a story to be told. And I ran across a headline that said, Pulaski remains just found 100 feet deep, 30 miles off the coast of North Carolina. I was like, ding, 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 ding. This is why I wasn't interested until now, because it was this perfect timing confluence of events. So while shipwreck hunters were bringing up the lost treasure, I was bringing up the lost stories, and we just melded them together. So the way we kind of compare them as mirror images is, number one, it was carrying the elite of the area. Now, this wasn't the first journey for this ship like it was for the Titanic. It was the 4th, but it was only the 4th journey. The other interesting thing is that the owner and the financier and the designer was on the ship with his family. He brought his wife, his 6 children, his niece, and his sister on this journey. And the other is the way it went down. It broke in the middle, and the bow and the aft went down like this, and it sunk just like the Titanic did, with both ends sticking up. And it took approximately 45 minutes for it to go down. So during those 45 minutes, everyone was fighting for their life in the middle of the night, in the middle of the ocean. And lastly, there weren't enough lifeboats. There were 4 lifeboats on the Pulaski, a beautiful, elegant steamship. There were 4 lifeboats, and 2 of them weren't seaworthy. And there were 200 passengers. So even if those 2 had been seaworthy, there weren't enough for everybody on the ship.
How many survivor accounts were you able to utilize in the telling of the story?
1/3 of the people, about 60 people, survived. So that a couple of them have left behind accountings. It's been almost 200 years, so they're hard to find. There's some letters, there's some accountings, there's some newspaper articles, but there is no one seminal work on the ship.
Until now, thanks to your extraordinary work, was Savannah history professor Everly Winthrop based on a real-life muse? And how did you finally settle on that powerful title, Surviving Savannah?
It's a modern day historical back and forth timeline because we watch them bringing up the treasure. So Everly Winthrop, the main character in the modern day story, is completely imagined. The 2 women we follow on the ship in the historical part of the novel, they are based on and inspired by very real people and a very real family that boarded that ship together. So it was a combo of imagination and historical accuracy. But even though Everly was completely imagined, I gave her a lot of the experiences that I had when I was researching the book. Visiting the museums, interviewing people, working with the shipwreck hunter, looking for lost journals and letters and articles. So I gave her some of my experience, but she's definitely not me. Surviving Savannah was the working title, and usually my working titles change, but it just never changed. I had probably 20 other titles, none of which I can remember right now, but the publishing house and I just kept coming back again and again and again to Surviving Savannah. The problem is it gets called Saving Savannah, Surrendering Savannah, all kind of things. But the theme of surviving the surviving is the umbrella under which that story is told. And so the word surviving really needed to be in there.